These are the AUNE AR9000 open-backed dynamic driver, or actually carbon driver, high-end headphones. And I reckon that they may just be the high-end headphone bargain of 2026. If you can call $13.99 USD or €14.99 a bargain for your $1,400 or $1,500 odd dollars, you actually get quite a radical looking pair of headphones. I think the unique take that they have, as I said, that they have a carbon fiber driver. And we're not talking about carbon fiber coated driver. We're actually talking about multi-layer carbon fiber. And then this kind of setup, that results in some pretty impressive sound quality. Now, these have been anticipated for a few years now, and AUNE have sent me them actually just before CanJam SoCal 2026. So this is a little bit of a rushed review and my first impressions, more or less, but I've gone through a lot of the music I have and plugged them into as many things as I reasonably can. And these are not the kind of headphones I would say just plug into your portable whatever, but they value very much being plugged into high-end gear like the stuff behind me, and that's how much they scaled up. Now, as far as ergonomics go, I actually think they look pretty well made. There's a mix of metal and plastic. You have a very stylish design, one that albeit has very practical purpose behind it. The earpads are pull-on type, and then behind that is a carefully arranged acoustic mesh with the drivers angled low and tilted forward to get an optimal sound stage. And I think it's about 490 grams, but they don't feel heavy at all on the ears. If anything, they feel like there's plenty of space around my average sized ears, and there's a bit of pressure on my head, but not too much. And the adjustment is kind of on the inside with some clicky plastic, but my only thing that I don't like about that is if I've got them on my head, it's a little bit harder for me to adjust them than if the adjustment thing is on the outside where I can just push and pull using my thumbs and fingers. But otherwise, once they get in place, they seem to stay there. And I get the impression that AUNE have designed them in a way that you can take them apart and repair them as necessary, which is a good thing. Now, they come with what they describe as a silver-plated copper cable, not particularly exciting looking, but one that has detachable plugs on the amp end. And they give the full complement of 3.5, 4.4, 6.3 millimeter connectors and 4-pin XLR. And that means you get, 4 cables in one with only, one part having to change, much like you get on a lot of in-ear monitors these days. And on the headphone end, you have 3.5 millimeter connectors, which means the cable and the headphones, I should say, are compatible with cables from other manufacturers. Actually, something I'll talk about a bit later. The next thing is, I've got to say they come with a really nice case. I haven't seen a case quite like this since I got my Focal Utopia 2022s. It's got a molded inner section, much the same. I wonder if it's from the same manufacturer, actually. And it is a really nice case to use for both protecting the headphones and taking them somewhere. Unfortunately for my trip, I'd love to take a pair of these headphones with me and show people at CanJam SoCal, but my suitcase is full. The reason I want to take these with me, but unfortunately can't, is because they're awesome. And they've been hyped up quite a bit, and I have to honestly say the hype is pretty much real. And there's not a lot negative to say about the sound quality. If anything, they started off on my head out of the TT2&M scaler, sounding kind of bright and open. But after a few hours of play, they came through some bass that was so impressive that when particular bass notes had distortion baked in that I hadn't heard before, I thought it was actually something wrong with the headphones, until I realized that that was actually in the music. But overall, the sound signature, I'd probably say that it has that speed of delivery that you get out of Focal headphones, but with a darker overall sound signature, especially in the mid-range, making vocals and instruments sound, warmer and darker and more intimate. It also, sort of like Focal headphones, like my Utopia 2022s, is a little bit more intimate sounding. So especially if you're used to planar magnetic headphones, such as from Hi-Fi Man, it's going to sound more intimate. But at the same time, it delivers such a degree of nuance that when I was listening to things like Dead Can Dance's Mushin, which has numerous instruments from around the world, I can make out details from each of the instruments and their timbre and nature very clearly through the systems I have here. While the bass is gently elevated, I tend to find that the fact that it follows more of a straight line means that, to me, the mid bass is elevated a little bit above neutral in a tasteful way, much as you tend to get with old style planers, and especially so given that the mid range is pulled back a bit. Now the treble is a tricky one because it has a bit of spikes and dips which may or may not match with your own ears, as there's considerable variance in how your ears reflect or absorb frequencies up in the higher range. It can range, 5 to 10 decibels in some cases. So if you have a peak in the headphones that matches the peak in your ears, that can be terrible. But if it's the opposite, it can be great. Now to me, the higher frequency peaks that are shown in the only graph I could find online, which was from headphones.com, didn't seem quite so exacerbated as my ears would detect. There was a 6 kilohertz peak and a 9 kilohertz peak, and I didn't really notice the 9 kilohertz one, but the 6 kilohertz one I noticed somewhat. It should be noted, of course, that the measurement rig they were using for that tends to emphasize the treble more in how the measurements come out, and also because the measurement is compensated for the diffuse field, which you see with that dotted line that runs in a diagonal from the bass through to the treble, you don't see the usual hump that other non-compensated measurements will have, which is the pinna gain. So it can be a little bit confusing to read and should just be taken with somewhat of a grain of salt, as your own ears will hear differently from a measurement rig. But depending how you position actually the preference curve that they use, which can be raised up or down versus the frequency response to give different impressions, I'd probably say the main feature is that pulled back 2 to 3 kilohertz region, which being not as prominent as I'm used to in some other headphones, whether it be Hi-Fi Man, Sennheiser, or especially Dan Clark Audio that tends to follow the Harman curve, which has that quite a bit higher. Sometimes the warmer sounding vocals and instruments were a little bit too dark and not quite intense enough for my liking. For example, Violet Times by St. Vincent, that's a very intense track, which on most headphones comes through with the singer very much in your face. And the slight edginess of the mastering is quite prominent as well. But through the AR9000s, that prominent mid-range was a little bit muted. And that can be kind of handy if the music you're listening to is modern, pop and rock, and there's a bit of distortion, as that lower 2 to 3 kilohertz region can tame that relative to the other frequencies. However, in the times you want real intensity, especially given the detail that these headphones seem to be able to retrieve with things like guitar notes and the subtle vibrations of, say, vocals and other notes, which I hadn't noticed often with other headphones, even planar headphones, are slightly muted by that particular frequency arrangement. Now, of course, you can EQ, but for the most part, I really liked how they presented music, especially if you tend to find the mid-range of, say, modern Harman-tuned headphones to be a bit too intense through the mid-range. These may be more tasteful. A good example of all this was The Sun is Shining by Bob Marley and the Wailers. Now, this is not usually my kind of music, but for some reason I really like this track from him. And hearing the subtle warbles in his voice, which I hadn't noticed with other headphones, was really delightful. The overall track being spacious was just a lot of fun, especially with a good balance of bass punch. Being a less modern track, it didn't have walloping amounts of bass like some other music does, and it balanced up really nicely through the AR9000s, although still I would have wished the mid-range would be a touch more forward. The next track on the list I was listening to was Sol Makusa by Manu Dibango, and that came through with a very prominent bass to begin with, and it was almost jumped out of my chair because I had the volume turned up a bit. Being a more modern recording, it was very impactful through the AR9000s and a lot of fun to listen to. What was interesting is I thought then I should move around different gear with listening to these to see how they change. Now, they seem to be fairly easy to drive at 43 ohms and about 102 decibels per milliwatt, or I assume it's 100 milliwatts they're measuring in. So I assume that they would be fairly easy to drive even out of portable gear. Moving in the other direction though, going instead of directly from the TT2, but through the Mjolnir behind me, I noticed that the amount of bass increased and it became warmer overall. Actually, using AUNE's own BX2 Magnum, which I got in for taking with me to CanJam, that has a switch which not just for gain, but another switch for current gain. and switching it to low and high current gain, the higher current gain definitely increased the dynamics. So these headphones definitely respond to the kind of amplification you have. Similarly, Hi-Fi Man's Serenade, while it has good Class A amplification in there, the softer presentation of the R2R DAC in the Serenade was very apparent through these headphones. Similarly, if I went down to FIO's M33 DAP directly, the overall presentation became a lot softer and a lot less detailed, suggesting that the AR9000s work best when you use as high-end amplification as you can get. Overall then, that leads me to think that the AR9000s, given the incredible detail, albeit maybe without the most finest nuance that you can get, but with a lot of slightly more macro detail available, and maybe quite a lack of distortion throughout the mid-range and treble according to the graph they have on their site, is a really fantastic headphone, especially if you don't like the more forward mid-range that you have in a lot of modern headphones, but want something a little bit darker and more forgiving, and the treble balance works out for you. One more thing though, is that to me, because they sounded a little bit too dark for my preferences, I was scratching my head and remembered that I have a drawer full of cables. Now, if you're allergic to cables and find them objectionable, you can skip the rest of this video. But I thought then, I have a cable on hand that generally I find when I plug it into headphones is a little bit too bright and annoying. And that was the final DX4000 cable, or I should say the same one as they use on their D8000s and 8000 Pros. And that is a very chunky and heavy silver-plated copper cable. So I switched that cable in to the AR9000s, and I felt that the soundstage opened up a bit, and the headphone became maybe a touch more open in the treble as well. It wasn't a huge thing, but it was enough to make the headphones perform at a little bit better level than they were before, and sounding more open, a touch more forward in the mids. That balanced things up just enough for me to find these to be fantastically enjoyable. I think that when I get back from CanGym, I'm going to be listening with the AR9000s a lot, and they're going to become one of my regular gear testing headphones, as they seem to respond to amplification quite strongly. The last negative about the AR9000s is availability. And they don't seem to be readily available, say, in North America, and I'm not sure how much in Europe. But regardless, especially with expensive purchases, I always recommend you check out any even vaguely local dealer or store, or CanGym if they are available, because that will save you a lot of money if you can try a bunch of headphones first, or use a store that has a good return policy. Similarly, if you do end up getting a pair or have a pair, let me know how you went and what setup you used and what music you listened to in the comments, so that other people who are thinking of investing that almost $1,400 or $1,500 into a pair of these can get a clearer idea of what they're like. As always, thank you to sponsors, patrons, and other supporters. And if this video helped you, do consider leaving a super thanks or buy me a coffee.